Hello. The focus of this video is interest groups. Interest groups are discussed in the first half of Chapter 6, so please make sure you read that before attempting any questions this week. But I wanted to talk just for a minute about interest groups and what they are and what they do. So interest groups have always existed in the United States. There were associations back in the late 18th and early 19th centuries when the country was just getting off the ground. At that time, a lot of people referred to them as factions, and they were viewed as being something negative. But the reason they exist is because our Constitution protects the right of people to express their opinions. That's the First Amendment, and people have the right to join associations. So we have always had interest groups. We always will have interest groups. In terms of the variety and kinds of interest groups, please make sure you read the material in Chapter 7. Chapter 7 has a list of different kinds of interest groups, so you can kind of get a sense of kind of what they are and what kinds of issues they focus on. In terms of what they do, interest groups, their main focus is on lobbying. To lobby means to put pressure on the government to do something. And so interest groups obviously have a goal. There's an issue they're focused on, so maybe a labor union would focus on working conditions, or a business group might focus on regulations, or certainly an environmental group would focus on the topic of global warming and environmental regulations. But they're trying to put pressure on Congress to do something legislatively that will benefit the group, that will reflect the group's goals. They also will, so they put direct pressure on members of Congress with their lobbyists in Washington, D.C. Every association, major association that exists, has lobbyists working in Washington who meet with members of Congress on a regular basis. In addition to the direct lobbying, they also will try to appeal to public opinion. That's known as outside lobbying or indirect efforts. They may contact their members by email and prompt them to contact their members of Congress about an issue. So, for example, the faculty here at Henry Ford are members of the AFT, the American Federation of Teachers, and oftentimes our union will contact us when an issue is coming up in Washington or Lansing that affects teachers or that affects higher education or some other issue that our union is concerned about. And our union will ask us to contact our member of Congress or our legislator in Lansing to voice our opinion on that issue. So that's another example of outside lobbying. And certainly interest groups have an interest in who gets elected to office, so they will contribute money to members of Congress or other people running for office. All of that is perfectly legal as long as they're following campaign finance limits. Although in Chapter 8, we're going to see that the Supreme Court has lifted the lid on kind of those limits, and so it's possible now for interest groups to spend unlimited amounts of money on behalf of their favorite candidates, which some people believe it really drowns out the voices of the public, since most people don't have lots of money to spend on their issues. But the Supreme Court has ruled that groups do have a constitutional right to do that. That'll come up more in Chapter 8, but it is relevant to Chapter 7 as well. So interest groups, again, have always existed. They always will. The question is, do they have too much influence on our political process? Some people think they do, particularly because of the amount of money that they can contribute to candidates. Other people argue that since there are so many different groups in Washington, that the interests of almost every American are represented by some group, and that that's a good thing for our democracy. So there are kind of differing ideas about the value of interest groups. But the reality is that interest groups exist. They're not going away. And so that is something that's a feature of our political process and democracy. So please email me if you have any questions, and have a great week.